Hello, I want to welcome everybody back to the Archives and History Library. I hope everybody took advantage of the time to look at the exhibits that are over here, buy a few books and get some signatures, and maybe refight a battle or two with some of these guys. Before we get started, I would like to remind you about the drawing after Terry's speech, after Terry's lecture. There are 3 cases of Civil War bullets up here in 3 separate books. They're all new books that he has donated, and we're going to raffle those off. One thing before I turn the mic over to Dr. Antolini, everybody that has their cell phone, take it out and turn it off for me, please. These last 2 speakers have a lot of important things to say. We don't want to interrupt them. So we'll begin this afternoon with Dr. Katharine Antolini. She's an associate professor of American History and Gender Studies at West Virginia Wesleyan College. She's the author of multiple articles and books, including Memorializing Motherhood, Anna Jarvis, and the Struggle for the Control of Mother's Day, as well as Scarlett O'Hara as a Confederate Woman. Dr. Antolini is going to explore the role of women during the Civil War. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Antolini.
It's always nice to be with people who want to listen. I have students, and bless them, they have to show. But you wonder if they're really all that interested, right? But what has always drawn me to the war, and I realize this may be blasphemous for me to say, it's never been the battles. Never the epic battles or the campaigns. That was never what I found interesting. What I found interesting was the in-between history, what happened in between the battles and the campaigns and what life was like. And it's in that in-between history, of course, where the history of women resides, right? And their experiences. And when you study, regardless of what war you're looking at, and you're studying the in-between history or the stories of these women, you find this wonderful female legacy, whether it's Anna Strong, right, from the Revolution, who put her petticoats on the line as a sign for the culper ring. African-American slave women doing the same thing during the for the showing Union locations of Confederate regiments during the Civil War. There's this rich kind of legacy. Same thing, keep digging, right? You have Esther Reed and her group during the American Revolution who raised funds going door to door in Philadelphia and then made shirts to give to the Continental Army, stitched their name in it to make sure these soldiers knew where these shirts were coming from. Women during World War II who etched their names into the planes that they welded and riveted on. So there's this great, great female legacy that you can trace when you look the in-between history and you look at these women's experiences. So whether women's experiences are recognized or not, they're part of the story. They're there. They share in the glory, they share in the burden, they share in the criticisms of war. They're a part of it, whether or not they tend to make it into the main narrative, because we think of the history of war and military history as such a male domain, so women tend not to make it into the dominant narrative. And it's a habit, right? And Stephanie McCurry says it's a hard habit to break. Why are historians or even during the war itself, civilians and soldiers hesitant to tell the stories of the women and clear evidence of them being there, but not wanting to tell that story? And she suggests it's maybe because it's a way of us trying to lessen the destruction of war, right? If somehow women are kept out of it, that only men are the ones who suffer for war, that somehow it makes it easier to take. So she suggests maybe that's it. We want to leave women out of the story because it somehow lessens the destructive history of it. So when you're looking at women during the war and you're trying to find stories about them, and this one always struck me. So this is a story that was published in 1903, and she tells the story of a woman. She was a girl. She was 17, right before the war broke out. And so she ends up finding herself married to what will become a Confederate officer. So, telling her story, but look how it begins. This history was told over teacups. I mean, how many biographies about great military men start out with, this is a history told over teacups? And that while they were gossiping by the fireside with their needlework, realize what a heroine she was. So even when women's stories come out, they're kind of, or are chronicled, they're kind of incidental. And oh wait, there's this male narrative, and then there's these women, and then we tell our stories over teacups. When I teach a course at Wesleyan called Women During Times of War, and so I start at the American Revolution, and we end at World War II, because that's all I can cram in a semester. Right? So to make it easier to kind of discuss and to compare the roles that women played during war, I break them up into different kind of categories. So we look at classic home front, camp follower, virago, the warrior. And what happens with each role is that these women get a little bit closer to the war, right? So we start at the home front and at the battlefront as these women go through. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of provide a brief discussion of these roles and using examples of women from West Virginia, right, when it's possible to do so. I do want to add, I don't know if we'll have time, depends how fast I get through, there is a post-wartime role that women always play, too, that's associated with war, and you really see that especially in the wake of the Civil War, and that's women as keepers of memory, those mourners as commemorators. So that's also another important role that women play that's associated with war, and if we have time, then I'll also address that. All right, so let's start with that classic home front, right? Where women encourage their men to fight and bravely say, I will keep the home fires burning and I will do everything that needs to be done. The old saying, right, when men go to war, women go to work, that they will do all that. And of course, we're talking about women in Western Virginia. We're talking about also their stance on statehood, where they stand pro or against. So here's an example. Siren is she's a girl living in French Creek, which is in Upshur County. So she left a little bit of a diary during the war years, and she's proud. She has 3 brothers that are serving, and she's proud, of course, of statehood, right? And she's, I just wish I was a man, I could be part of it. So there is evidence of women being a part of and wanting to encourage their men to fight, proud of their men to fight, proud of, fighting for country and cause, and encouraging their men to go. Plenty of examples of women supporting the war effort on both sides, right? So you have the classic voluntary aid societies, whether they're local or larger, of raising money and raising goods to help supply the war effort. So you see that. And you also see more well-organized ones, the most popular, of course, being the U.S. Sanitary Commission. Even though it was male-led, it was the worker bees for women, right? Doing what was needed to what we recognize as public health, right? Caring for the needs of soldiers. There's also a lesser-known group, the Women's National Loyal League. This is a group that was formed by early women's rights activists, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They agreed, for the sake of the war, to put aside their fight to get the right to vote, to get behind the war effort. So their main goal, especially in the wake of the Emancipation Proclamation, was to make sure that end of slavery was a war goal. So it's not just preserving the Union, but preserving the Union without slavery in it anymore. So they led a huge petition drive to support what will become, right, the 13th Amendment. They had hoped to get 1 million signatures. They got about 400,000, not too shabby, really. And this group is sometimes referred to as the women's first political group because they were using the only political right that they had. Couldn't cast a vote, but they can petition. That was their one kind of political right. And what's really neat about when women signed these petitions, how important it was for them to sign their full names. So it wasn't just Mrs. John Smith, right? It'd be Mrs. Mary Smith, how important it was to be identified that way. In the South as well, you will have these voluntary societies, again, not as formalized as the U.S. Sanitary Commission, but will have women doing their part, right? And that's pretty impressive for a month of work. I don't know what one does with 128 pounds of tapioca, but it must have been important, right? You also have women, both North and South, working as what we call government girls, clerks. The biggest employer being the post office on both sides, also the Treasury Department on both sides, right? This is when we start to see what is called the feminization of clerking. Before the war, clerking is a male job, what we call now secretary, right? It was a male job. The belief that it wasn't a job appropriate for women to do, wasn't a job that women were capable of doing. During the war, hey, these women are capable of doing these clerking positions, and we don't have to pay them as much, which was handy, right? So we start to see, because of women's war work, the feminization of clerking, where being a secretary is still going to be what is today, a female-dominated job. You also have women who worked in factories on both sides, textile mills, especially in the North. But you also had women both in North and South in munitions factories. This is dangerous, right? First of all, it's dangerous to your reputation that to work as a government girl or in a factory, these are women working inside the home. So that in itself can risk, you risk being seen as a fast girl, a loose girl. There was, by 1865, there was over 400 women working as clerks in the US Treasury. And somebody accused the Treasury of being a house of orgies, that men were taking advantage of these women that would take these jobs. Must be of loose morals, and men were benefiting from them. It's also physically dangerous. You had explosions in factories both North and South, the worst one being in Richmond in 1863 that killed 50 women. We have to be careful, I think, though, when we discuss the Homefront, which is the classic stoic Melanie Wilkes Gone with the Wind image, right, of Homefront supporter. We have to be careful not to romanticize them too much, that to be truly patriotic, we have to enthusiastically encourage our men to go off to die in horrible, horrible ways, and to be left alone, right, in the midst of a war that's going to come through. So we have to be careful, I think, not to over romanticize and ignore the fact this is a war where the line between combatant and non-combatant is going to be a blurred one, and women are really going to experience horrible hardship in the wake of this. For example, the Libra Codes issued in 1863 to help codify Union rules of war, if you will. So there's articles in it meaning to protect women. Article 37, prohibition, not rape women, right? You need to protect women and the sacredness of domestic relations. But as you read through the Libra Codes, what really becomes a defining factor of whether or not you deserve protection is not your gender, it's not your sex, is whether or not you're loyal or not loyal. Right? Especially Section 10. Section 10 of Libra Codes is directly addressing in case of a civil war. And how do you define a loyal citizen that you need to protect and a disloyal citizen who is kind of fair game? And to simply be labeled as disloyal is to have sympathy, not even if you didn't do anything to openly aid the Confederacy. If you're known as a sympathizer, that could make you a target, label you as disloyal. Or of course, if you do anything to bring comfort to the enemy, that would also mark you as disloyal. So you're going to have women who fall into that category because they're sympathetic, because they're going to do what they felt they need to do to actively support, right? So we're talking about a lot of discretion to treat women as combatants, right? And so really experiencing the hardship of war in that direct kind of way. So this, coming from a letter of Martha Reed, and she's you have a mixture of that. I think it's much more honest reflection. Yes, she's dedicated. She's mad at those northern demons who are going to come and plunder and take away their way of life. And she realizes it's a sacrifice, and she's writing to her husband who's serving. But she realized the blood, right? It's going to be the blood of fathers and brothers and husbands who bring this forth. And then why I included this letter is that she also mentions what's happening in Hampshire County, not far from her, where you have the 85 houses burned and 5 women brutalized, right? So that's a much, I think, more honest understanding of what these women are experiencing, not these stoic women who bravely send their men off, but then really suffering the consequences of war. The next category are the camp followers. And I'm defining camp followers in a broader term, not the derogatory prostitute, right? But in a broader term, women who find themselves associated with the camps, either because they're literally following them or there's an encampment by their homes, right? So you do have women who do follow the camps because they follow their husbands. And they're sometimes referred to as daughters of the regiment, right? To recognize that they're there following their men into war. Refugees have nowhere else to go. And any means of survival is to follow the camps. Of course, prostitutes, I mean, if that's your trade, you got to go where the men are. But these women who are at camps are serving a purpose, right? They're serving as cooks, doing laundry. Also, in a war where disease is going to take out more men than anything else, the importance of sanitation and having women near camps helped with sanitation issues because they were just more conscious of that kind of stuff. So these women certainly did their part when being part of these camps. I also include in this category nurses, right? So about 10,000 women served as nurses. Not all of them, of course, got paid. So I also mean the nurses that were well behind the battlefields, but also the nurses that found themselves closer up or found themselves treating men in camps, because they're really seeing firsthand, right, the casualties and costs of war. One historian estimates about 10% of women who served as nurses during the Civil War suffered some kind of mental breakdown because of what they had experienced. So this brings me to an example closer to my research. Anne Reeves Jarvis is famous in Taylor County lore. Beginning in 1858, she's recognizing there's a high infant mortality rate, which is, again, it's early 19th century, this is common. But there she is savvy enough, and the mothers that she begins to work with is savvy enough to realize it's tied to, again, what we refer to as issues of public health, right? Stop the spread of diseases, stop the contamination of milk supplies. So she agrees to form what are known as Mother's Day work clubs, where they would get together and educate themselves on the best way to keep their children alive, as well as to educate other mothers on let's keep our children alive. So this is happening before the war breaks out. War breaks out. And now her clubs, which will have women who will have men go on either side, are kind of caught in the middle of, the war. So the Jarvis family is a loyal Union family, even though her husband doesn't fight, but he does hire a substitute to fight for him. So still loyal Union. She is, as legend goes, was the only one brave enough in Grafton to pray over Brown's body, right? Knowing that her secession neighbors would not be happy with her, and how she bravely did it anyway, because she was such a proud, loyal to the Union. So the story continues as men become encamped in Taylor County, that disease already starts to spread. The lore is Latham comes to her and says, I know about the work that you did before the war. Can you please organize your women to help? And so Jarvis says, sure, I will, but keep in mind that our mothers have, we have sons and husbands on both sides, so what we do to one side, we will also serve and do for the other. All I know about what they did is that, quote, gratitude and highest recommendations, no details of exactly what they did to help these men, right? I can just, assume, right, what kind of general sanitation and nursing needs, but all the men felt to leave behind was gratitude and highest recommendations made to these women who helped tend to these men. This is what I mean, you gotta look in that in-between history, right? So during this time, and Mrs. Jarvis will have 13 kids, and only 4 of them will live to adulthood. During the war years, where she did all these great things, and these men, all these accolades for her role in helping the encampment, she carried 3 pregnancies and buried 5 children, right? And so the diseases that were sweeping through the camps were taking her kids out. But that's not what's left behind. The story that's left behind is accolades and gratitude for what these women did, and not really looking at their experience. That's why I really enjoy, if you like this kind of topic, Diane Somerville, who's really looking at, in her work, the psychological, right, and emotional costs of war. And she said, we admire these women, these stoic women of the Homefront, and we forget that those who staggered under the weight of added responsibilities, collapsed in the wake of grief and loss, and sought to escape a gloomy future through death, right? So we forget, when we romanticize these women and their roles, really what the costs could be. And of course, Anna Jarvis is the woman who goes on for you, who are Golden Horseshoe winners, right? Who go on and is the founder of Mother's Day. Next role, all right, again, what kind of brings us closer to the war front, is that female warrior, right? So these are the women who picked up guns and were willing to use them. Home guards, spies, scouts, right? Again, we're talking about evidence of blurring that line between just because you're a woman doesn't mean you're automatically a non-combatant, right? That now women are falling into this category, as it says in the Libra Codes, that regardless of sex, right, you will be punished, right, if you serve as a spy or war traitor or rebel. So here we go, are women who are doing that, and then are risking their lives and the punishment that comes with their decisions. Famous ones in our area, Belle Boyd, of course, right, who is Martinsburg. She is famous. Another young woman, supposedly really beautiful. So, all these spies are always described as really beautiful and using their feminine wiles, right, to get information from men and con their way, cross lines, whatever. So she's famous. She starts her career as a spy after she shoots a Union soldier for hoisting a Union flag above her house and gets away with it. And then goes on to be, she's also famous for helping Stonewall Jackson, feeding him information during his campaign. In Richmond, she gets the honorary title of captain, right? She will also be sent on behalf of the Confederacy to England to pass on, to be as a courier, to pass on information to those who are sympathetic to the Confederacy. In England, she will be imprisoned twice. My favorite story about Boyd is that she supposedly had a horse that could kneel and hide and be very quiet as Yankee men marched by. All right, Nancy Hart, Roane County, who was attached to a guerrilla fighting group. She began, again, another young girl who saw her brother-in-law shot by a Union soldier and saw her neighbors harassed by Union soldiers and decided to do her part. She is famous for helping the plan and lead the raid on Somerville. This is after she also escaped captivity by tricking a man to get a Union soldier to give him her gun, and then she shot him with it. So again, the idea that these women are so beautiful and cunning, and men are put off by the fact that these women will, shoot them. Next category, finally there, all right, the Indigenous Warrior. These are the women who dressed and passed themselves off like men in order to fight. So about 400 estimates, right, fought in the Union. Of that 400, 3 African-American women have been identified who passed themselves off as men to fight roughly 250 fighting in the Confederacy. Apparently, it was easier than you would think to enlist. It wasn't rigorous medical examination, clearly, right, to enlist. So if you were a convincing man, you got in. If you were also a convincing teenager. So I think what also helped these women pass as men, how do you explain that you're kind of petite and you can't grow any facial hair? Well, you're a young man. So that helped the fact that there were 6 women who made it through the war as drummer boys. So that's how they explain why they never grew any facial hair and were small, right? So it was easier than you would think. So there's evidence of women serving in all kinds of duties in war, right? What you would expect. And so women being found, according to one research, the highest rank was of major. So some woman made it to major before she was discovered. So that's the highest known rank. Of course, some of these women will never be identified because they were blown to bits and you'll never identify who they are. But some of them are caught while still living, and then their stories end up being told. So you get discovered by being wounded and being sick. The stories of the women who were shot tried to tend to themselves. So they to risk not being discovered, but sometimes you just simply can't help that. So sick or wounded. My favorite is they gave birth. Kind of hard to, explain that one. About 8 women were discovered simply because they gave birth while serving as a man in the war. Some kind of failure of masculine performance, right? They just did not do masculinity well. My favorite story was they were in an apple orchard, and the men were just throwing apples. And the woman who was passing herself off as a man was kind of caught off guard, and an apple came at her, and she would make a movement like she had an apron, right? Like a woman would she would use her apron to catch something coming at her, and just by reflex, that's what she did. So totally, that's how she got caught, because these men are like, why would you do that, right? So didn't do well. They're discovered because the remains are discovered. So it's believed that there were women in every major battle, every major campaign, and sometimes their remains have been found right after the war or years later when skeleton remains are found, and it's clearly a skeleton of a woman. So they've been discovered. Frances Clayton, that's the most common picture that you see. She followed her husband into battle. Her husband did not survive, and she continued for about a year after her husband was killed, still passing herself off as Jack Williams. My students that's their favorite part, right? These women who, dress as men and fight, because they didn't know that they did that, right? That women did that, so it's shocking to them, so it's always their favorite part. But during the war, people knew that women were doing this. It was popular. Stories would appear in newspapers all the time about these women who are discovered. So it's not just a huge secret. During the war, everybody knew, because there were stories all the time. And of course, the stories were more popular when the women talk about going into battle for love or for patriotism. If they just wanted to go in because they needed the money or they were adventurous, that wasn't the story people wanted to hear, right? They wanted to hear about these women who, out of love for country or love for a man, were willing to do this. But it would make it into the paper. So, example, Jenny was caught in Fayetteville, right? So, a story of her capture was printed in Nashville Dispatch, who got it from a Baltimore paper. So these stories would go and be passed from paper to paper to paper, talking about these women. So people knew women were doing this during the war. It also became popular in literature, in fiction. So I bring up the story of The Lady Lieutenant, which was published in 1862, and it's supposed to tell a true story about a woman who goes into the war to be with her intended, to be with her beloved, and she ends up being in his same regiment, and the whole time he can't figure out why she is familiar to him, right? So that's the whole thing, that he's drawn to this young soldier, but you can't figure why he's so familiar to her. But the reason I mention it is because the whole of it is set in Western Virginia. So she follows her man into the Union Army, and they find themselves in Western Virginia, right, fighting to save us. Discussion of these women also appear in military records, and also soldiers writing home, talking about so-and-so in their ranks was discovered to be a woman. So there's plenty of evidence of these women being there. So it's funny to my students that they don't, they're shocked that they don't know. How come we don't know these things? Because clearly during the war, everybody knew it. It was a very open secret, right? And of course, in our area, Harper's Ferry, record of catching 2 women who were arrested for lording about the camps dressed in U.S. Uniform. What I like about the little report about these women being caught is the fear that there's more of them. We've got to be on the lookout, because they said there's more of them just like them, so we've got to keep on the lookout for those. So right after the war, right, these women that were making it in newspapers, were clearly written in men's letters or making it into military records, kind of disappear from the narrative after the war. Like somehow they don't deserve to be classified as women who deserve the accolades of war, because they chose not to fight as women, they chose to fight as men. So this account, talking about women's work in the war in 1867, when it was published, they opened their chapter on military heroines, clearly saying, we mean the women who fought as women. We don't count as heroines or those women who chose to give up the prerogatives of their sex and chose to fight like men. We don't count them in our story. But then again, we have to be careful, always be careful, right? Again, students love that part. They love talking about these women. And the fact that going with that phrase, well-behaved women really make history, is this notion that in order to be seen as a history maker, you behave like men, which I think is unfair, right? So yes, the women who behaved like men during the war certainly do deserve credit for being active forces in war, but doesn't mean that the women who took more traditional roles on the home front or in the camp followers does not deserve the same amount of respect and credit for their service in war, just like the women who behaved like men, who tend to get all the glory for that behavior. Okay, so we have time since we started early, right? All right, so after the war, we have women who then serve as the keepers of memory, right? That as mourners, which is the natural extension, women were always mourners, and you know about the whole glorified mourning rituals of the 19th century. So women were always mourners. And during the war, wearing black was a kind of symbol of your own patriotism, right? It's a symbol of your own sacrifice. You sacrificed your men to go and fight, and they did not live. So wearing black was kind of a symbol of your patriotism in that way, because you sacrificed somebody you loved to war. So after the war, women who organized themselves to memorialize, right, the men that fought, right? Whether it's the Ladies' Aid Societies, of course, go on to be the Daughters of the Confederacy, and then, of course, those tied to the GAR. Origins of Memorial Day, right, come out of the Civil War, and how important women were in the origins of these Memorial Days, particularly in the South, during the period of Reconstruction, where Confederate veterans could not publicly celebrate their dead without being called unrepentant traitors, right? How dare you, right? You committed treason. How dare you commemorate your dead? But women could get away with that in the South because they're just women, and they're apolitical, and they're just mourners, and they just want to tend to these Confederate graves that are being ignored, right? And so they got away with it. So particularly in the South, the Confederate Memorial Days that these women helped organize were particularly important. In the North, Memorial Days tended to be male-led, GAR, male-led, male-dominated. But in the South, Memorial Days, especially during Reconstruction, were very female-dominated and female-led because they could get away with it in a way. So they were even honored. They are now the pious custodians of all that is Confederate memory because they could get away with it, right? So they, in their own way, could continue fighting the war through memory, right? The kind of lost cause, right? Start of the lost cause, in a way that their men could not. And the idea that they were not political, these women chose the days that they would choose for their Memorial Days. June 3rd was Jefferson Davis's birthday. That's random. You pick that as a Memorial Day in your city. So it wasn't, these women were acting in what we would recognize in political ways, but they were getting away with it because as women, they were seen as apolitical. Once Reconstruction is over, men take back over, dominating the Memorial Days. Of course, if you're from Marion County, I would be remiss not to tie Julia Pierpont into the story. Even though the story of Julia Pierpont getting credit for Memorial Day is something that doesn't make it outside of West Virginia discussions, but she is credited, right, as being one of the first to issue a Memorial Day. So what happens? War is over. Her husband is sent to Richmond, right, to continue serving as governor. They're there to 68. So in 1866, she organizes in Richmond, a early Memorial Day, where African American school children line up and take flowers to decorate the Union grades. And so supposedly, this is the start of Memorial Day. Certainly a voice of it, right? The work being done to commemorate grades were actually going on before 1866. But, we gotta throw West Virginia in there whenever we can make that connection. So Marion County does have Juliet Pierpont Day that they celebrate the day before, the Saturday before Memorial Day, to kind of celebrate her role in it. I believe that's it. Yes. All right, so I had time. So is there any questions? Yeah.
Do you have the names of the two female spies that were shot up by Carriage Trail?
No, I do not. Sorry.
So, Doctor, what do you find the most interesting part of this? You've got 4 different topics there. What do you focus on?
They're all interesting in their own way. I don't know, because especially if you go through and you look at, again, was it the Revolution or Civil War, World War I, World War II, all the roles are just fascinating. And I think, especially with my students, they know the classic role, right, the traditional kind of home front. They don't know the other categories. And so to them, that's the most appealing. But again, I am drawn back to the home front, the kind of classic.
Certainly Sherman figured this out, that this was the essence of defeating the South, was to get to the women more than anything else. Do you not agree with that?
Yes, Drew Faust argues that all the varied reasons why you want to argue why the South lost is the women stopped supporting it. There was women who would, of course, write to their men, you need to come home, right? So the desertion rates were, of course, higher for the Confederacy, and the women who wrote there, like, you need to come home, right? You need to help us. The family is more important than the cause. You need to come home. Also, the women who, then they would hide their men when they came looking for them. Women who, of course, the bread riots, right? All the food riots in the South that were led by women who were starving and were tired of sacrificing and wanted to take what they felt that they deserved. Because the Confederacy promised they would protect them, and they weren't doing it. The women that would burn cotton fields, upset that food, because the Confederacy tried to get farmers, you need to stop, less cotton, more food, right? Plant more food crops. And so women who were starving, resentful of the cotton crop still being grown, and would set them ablaze. One of my favorite stories is women who would steal sheep and would get all their wool off of it and give the sheep back, but would take all the wool off them, so because they needed to clothe their own family. So they wouldn't kill the sheep, they would just shear them and give them back, but would steal them. All right, so you can clearly see, that's why when he mentioned the article, I mean, I wrote that in graduate school, where it was a conference on war films. All right, Gone with the Wind is a war film, right? So that's what I chose. And I argued that Scarlett O'Hara is probably a better reflection of what Southern women felt, right? Not caring that much for hospital work, resentful that they're left behind to run a plantation and to manage slave labor that they did not feel prepared to manage, right? And the violence that must be used to maintain slave labor, and women who are very uncomfortable using that violence to maintain slave labor. And women who are just mad about the war and why is this stupid war. So I think Scarlett was more reflective than Melanie, who was the ultimate, right? Gave up her wedding ring if it would support the cause, right? Kind of stoic image that's idealized, but I think Scarlett is probably a better reflection of women. Yeah.
Just one comment. The monument that you used with your UDC and the Women of the GAR slide, Mountaineer, which sits just opposite of this side of the Capitol, the corner of what was Washington Street and California Avenue, or California Street, when that was awarded to Henry Kirk Bush Brown, and Henry Kirk Bush Brown is one of the preeminent sculptors for Civil War memorials at the beginning of the 20th century. His wife was an artist named Margaret Leslie Bush Brown. She was very active in the suffragist movement. And so when he received that commission, and he came to West Virginia for a couple of years because he was touring the state to find the perfect mountaineer soldier to be on top of it, she told him, don't forget the women. And so Mountaineer on our Capitol grounds, most people focus on the sculpture on the top, but if you look at the two relief panels on the side, one looks at women in the home front, and then one looks at women serving as nurses. And so it really is one of the earliest examples of a sculptor in a state memorializing the role of women in the Civil War, and it's right here in Charleston.
Who was primarily responsible for the concept of the lost cause? Was it men or women, or was it a little bit of both?
Well, yeah.
Monuments and
Women certainly played a part in that. I mean, I think that some of the, yeah, and it's the literature, but as keepers of the Confederacy, they were part of that, right? They could keep what never existed, right? The thought of they kept that alive. Maybe
women tend to tell the story.
Right. And they could, especially in the South, they could get away with it a lot longer and not be criticized for it. Yeah, so they're kind of the keeper of these memories. Then you have, of course, with the Daughters of the Confederacy, those are women who weren't alive during the war. So they're commemorating more of a lost cause idea of it, because the Ladies' Aid Societies that were created right after the war, they lived through, they knew the war. The Daughters of the Confederacy just knew what they were told about the war more. And so that kind of also plays into the kind of monuments that they create and dedicate and are a part of.
As you know, I always have more than one question.
Okay.
I'm very interested in whether or not there were veterans organizations, as there are today, and did these women essentially, were they members of those veterans organizations?
They're auxiliary. Right, yeah.
You mean even if they asked as soldiers?
Yeah, they weren't, no. They weren't, because once you're caught, you are, you're not allowed to stay. Though there are evidence arguing that women that were caught in the Confederate ranks were less likely to get booted because of the need of the soldiers, and they were less likely to immediately be drummed out of the military, if you
The
will.
men were paid, or the soldiers were paid how? They were paid directly?
I believe, right? Really, the military men historians may know, but yeah, the women would, if they passed as men, they were treated in the same way.
So in other words, they received money on a regular
Yes.
basis, supposedly.
So
And then if they wanted to send that home, they sent that home just
I'm
like
assuming. Some of the women soldiers some of the women who were the most successful that passed were already passing as men before the war broke out. So some of them kind of win with an advantage. For whatever reason, they were fleeing a bad marriage, or they were wanting to live independent lives, and to do so, they passed as men. So some of the more successful of the soldiers, of women, were living and passing as men even before the war broke out. So it was just easy for them to enlist.
Weren't a lot of the soldiers that they served with aware that they were women, really? And did they get pregnant, I guess?
Well, but some of them also, you're talking about how do you be successful, is at least somebody knows your secret, right? And so if you have one or two, especially if you're in there with your husband, right, or a brother, or that they would help protect you.
That there were children born?
There were 6 pregnancies. 2 of them when they were POWs. Yes, so and of course there was women who just get caught because they didn't want to fight anymore, and they go, I'm a woman. So they just thought it was a good idea to enlist and decided they didn't want to anymore, so they just admitted that they were women so they could go home.
Was West Virginia any different than other states in regard to the number of women?
How many came out of West Virginia? That number I don't know. We just know a lot of the anecdotal, the ones that like the ones that are caught in Harper's Ferry or caught in Fayetteville. The systematic documentation of these women really began in the 1980s. So there are particularly women's historians who have spent years trying to track down and identify as many as they possibly can. And some of them you just never will, right? Just like soldiers that will never, males that will never be identified. But there's been painstaking research trying to track who these women were. And some women after the war became famous because they wrote their own autobiography and did tours. I mean, Belle Boyd, even though she was never pretended to be a man, tried to make a living off of telling her stories as spies. So that wasn't uncommon either. Yeah.
Is the phenomena of androgynous females in the war something that we see on both sides equally, or was one side more apt to have these females in their ranks?
Union, because they're just number-wise, right? It was more apt. Of course, you also saw that in the American Revolution. There were women who passed. So it's not Civil War wasn't the first time we see that happen. There were women who did it to the American Revolution as well. War I, War II, more rigorous, right? More rigorous medical exams. You're not going to be able to do that.
What kind of punishments were put in place, if any, when they were caught?
They weren't executed. Sometimes the first instinct is that they were spies. And so it's having to get through whether or not you were spies. You may be briefly imprisoned, but mostly you're just, discharged. But they have your first suspicion that you were spying. Or why would you be doing that? Yeah. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you.
All right, well, we're running ahead here by about 25 minutes, so I'm going to talk for just a second. I want to thank all of you for coming out and supporting this. This is the first time we've done something of this nature, and we'd really like to try to make it an annual event, so check your email coming up. Excuse me. And with that said, I would also like to take a moment to thank Steve Cunningham, 35th Star Publishing over here. He's been very humble throughout this whole process, but I would not have been able to put this together without him. He has put me in contact with a number of the speakers that you've enjoyed today, and he's volunteered a lot of his time. He's been at the end of the phone every time I've needed him, or an email. So if everybody would, give him a round of applause, please. And more important, for those of you who haven't yet, buy a book from him. He's not getting paid to be here. I'd also like to thank Hunter back here. He's traveled a long distance to be with us. He's a hard man to get a hold or to get down here into the Kanawha Valley, from what I understand. I do want to appreciate him and his trip. So everybody, once again, let's thank him. Mr. Rick Wolf in the back corner. I hope all of you have seen his photo display that he's brought in. I've been told he travels to the Mansfield show, Militaria show every year and wins awards. And he was kind enough to come down here and display for us for free so that you guys would have something to see and show something of Civil War photography that we don't get to see every day. So thank you, Rick. I'd also be remiss if I didn't thank the staff here, Mike on the camera, Joe for allowing me to see this through to the end. Mary back there for counting all your heads, which is probably the hardest job that we've had here, because every one of you gets up and move around. And Mr. Brown up here, he's handing out your raffle tickets. So does everybody here have a raffle ticket? Yeah, if you don't have one, see Cody here real fast. Staff, you're not allowed to win. Family of staff, you're not allowed to win. I had to throw that in for my daughter here. Yeah. And Dr. Antolini, I really want to single her out for just a moment here. She tackled a tough subject that most of us, I can't imagine very many of us in this room have given more than a passing thought to, and she did an excellent job. So let's thank her once again.